purposes of going forward. I have always read that rule, although I grant you, the way you read it, it's broad enough, but I've always read that rule that to apply where a client and a lawyer are adverse to each other.
Okay, well, that's what I think
clearly
about
not
it.
the case.
And the thing is, Mr. Lonetti as the client, after the involvement of Mr. Benish, I mean, Mr. Lonetti, I think, could testify as to what his understanding as the client who's retaining Mr. Benish.
The problem
as to why Mr. Benish is being involved. Let me just finish. I would grant you, Mr. Gentile, that you as an attorney representing Mr. Lonetti and involving Mr. Benish would know even better, respectfully, than Mr. Lonetti as to why you want to have Mr. Benish be involved.
And isn't that really what's at issue?
It is, and I know you're going to testify, and I'm welcoming that, and I can't wait for it, actually, because I've got my own questions that probably will already be posed by Mr. Bingham. But in any event, Mr. Lonetti's on the stand. He was the client who, through your involvement to some extent, most likely, engaged the services of Mr. Benish. And so I think it's at least fair to allow Mr. Bingham to ask the client, what was your understanding as to what Mr. Benish was hired for, what happened at the June 21st meeting, and anything along those lines. But again, you know, I'm smart enough to know that the best witness probably on all this is you.
There's another issue here.
Okay.
And that is that this proceeding is now becoming a vehicle for discovering really attorney work product. Our theories, our tactics. When you're asking why was the man hired, aren't you really asking what is the strategy that Mr. Gentile is employing? But you know what? You've made your ruling.
It may overlap into some of that. I'll grant you that. But for example, if Mr. Lonetti were to say that Mr. Benish was retained to disclose conversations that he had when he was counsel for Virgin Valley with the various officers of that would be pretty relevant to me.
Well,
if he were
not
to say
only
that,
it more likely than not would be outside of any proper purpose. So I agree with you.
Your Honor, can we excuse the witness before we have any further colloquy on
Yeah, I
this
was
issue?
kind of thinking the same exact thing, but if we're moving on back to the question, then I think we're okay. But yeah, I think a lot of this is going on in front of the witness, and I think it's
Okay.
probably not.
well, that's probably a good point. Maybe we could, if we're going to continue the discussion, maybe we should do it that way.
There's nothing. I have nothing more to say. You've made your ruling.
Okay, so the bottom line is Mr. Lonetti can be asked questions as to his understanding as to why he, as a client, has involved Mr. Benish as essentially his lawyer. I mean, Benish is Mr. Lonetti's lawyer.
But not in this case. In an unrelated.
Well, and this is the exact kind of thing I don't want to discuss in front of the witness. I think that's what Mr. Gravette's raising, and I've been standing here hoping that it just stops because I think we should excuse Mr. Lonetti.
Well, I think we've covered it.
Okay.
You've got the sort of blessing from the court to inquire with this witness as to his understanding as a client as to why he involved Mr. Benish.
Okay.
Okay?
Mr. Lonetti, your understanding as a client was that you and Mr. Gentile were hiring George Benish because you faced liability in the criminal action and the civil action. Isn't that true?
I don't know if I can answer that because
Just based on your understanding.
this actually bypasses a lot of other things I did with George Benish. It leaves everything.
And we're aware of that,
It
Mr.
jumps over
Lonetti.
that.
I just want to know specifically as it relates to retaining George Benish. Your understanding as the client was that that was because you faced liability in both the civil action and the criminal action, correct?
That's why I hired Don Gentile.
Right. And then same thing with George Benish, right? He brought in the water law expertise to help with both the criminal and the civil claims.
I
correct?
make an objection to that because it assumes a fact that's not only not in evidence, but what is in evidence is contradictory. It is clear.
Your Honor, can we
that
just
the law
have...
firm of Gordon Silver hired Mr. Benish the purposes of this case.
Your Honor, the speaking of objections are becoming very problematic for us. I just think it should be left to a single objection, and I also think the same witness that's going to cross-examine or redirect Mr. Lonetti should be the same attorney. And we haven't followed that rule. And I realize there's a lot of relaxed procedures that have gone on here, but I think this is getting pretty far afield.
Well,
I would stipulate to that, Your Honor.
well, I mean, I'm sorry if you guys don't like the way this is happening, but I'm running it the way I think it needs to run.
I understand.
Okay? So that's what I'm going to continue to do. I actually think that last question that you asked Mr. Bingham was allowable. Do you want to repeat it?
I do, yes. Mr. Lonetti, I want to understand your understanding as the client. I don't really care what Dominic Gentile thought at this point. We'll question him later. But as you as the client, the reason that you hired George Benish was because you faced liability in both the civil and criminal actions. That's correct, is it not?
I'm not certain I can answer that because that is not why I hired George Benish.
As a client, though, you understood that Dominic Gentile was hiring George Benish for that purpose, correct?
Possibly.
Is that your understanding of why he was hiring him?
I'm still not sure I can answer that.
Mr. Gentile wasn't a water attorney. He had no idea about water law, as you said.
Okay.
George Benish had knowledge about Virgin Valley, the water rights and all of that. We're dealing with Virgin Valley water rights.
Wait a second. This is getting argumentative. Let me just take a point of order here. Mr. Lonetti, what was your understanding, if you had one, as to why Mr. Benish was engaged in the scenario we've been talking about?
I think he was engaged just to for lack of a better word, educate Mr. Gentile on Nevada water law, not just necessarily the Virgin Valley.
Okay.
So that was my.
And Mr. Gentile is from the law firm of Gordon Silver, correct? Mr. Gentile is from the law firm of Gordon Silver?
He is.
Gordon Silver has water attorneys in their firm, do they not? To your knowledge?
I do not know.
Did Mr. Gentile ever mention that they have an attorney in their office that practices water law?
No.
Did Mr. Gentile ever mention to you that they might need a conflict waiver in order to have George Benish be involved?
No.
Did Mr. Benish ever mention that a conflict waiver might be needed for him to become involved?
No.
Are you aware of any knowledge that Gordon Silver ever disclosed to Virgin Valley Water District that George Benish was involved in what you guys were doing?
I have no